This is the last presentation in this group of modules focused on disciplines and fields important to environmental health. It focuses on policy and regulation with respect to the environment. By the end of this presentation, the readings from the chapter and other things I ask you do, you should be able to understand what major agencies are that work with environmental health regulations at the international, national, state, and local levels. You should identify principles that guide environmental policy, discuss at least 5 major laws that have been introduced, and describe environmental policies designed to protect the vulnerable populations. An environmental policy is a statement by an organization of its intentions and principles in relation to its overall environmental performance. It provides a framework for action and setting objectives and targets. There are 4 principles to consider in developing environmental policy. The precautionary principle, we'll talk about environmental justice, environmental sustainability, and the polluter pays principle. The precautionary principle states that preventive, anticipatory measures should be taken when an activity raises threats of harm to the environment, wildlife, human health, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established. And a good example of this would be if we're not fully aware of the consequences of an environmental exposure, we should do our best to protect the public and the environment from the exposure. We don't have to have a full set of evidence before we make a decision. If you can think back to a very recent occurrence, Flint, Michigan, one of the catastrophes that happened was the state didn't add an anti-corrosive agent to the water source before it passed it through the pipes in their treatment plant. They said they could wait, even though it had been recommended. And so not adding that anti-corrosive was really in contrary to the precautionary principle, as one example. Environmental justice is an important concept in the United States, and as we start to think about how interconnected we all are as a world, it becomes important globally. But it's really about equal treatment in all people in society, irrespective of their racial background, country of origin, or socioeconomic status. And more importantly, it's equal rights and position to impact environmental regulations and conditions. Environmental sustainability focuses on the viewpoint that a strong, just, and wealthy society should be consistent with clean environment, healthy ecosystems, and a beautiful planet. And a good example of environmental sustainability is the recently announced Sustainable Development Goals that guide how, as a planet, we should work towards improvements in health and environment and economic conditions. The polluter pays principle identifies the source of the pollution should bear the expenses of the pollution prevention and control and make sure that the environment is in an acceptable state. A good example of a way that we use polluter pays principle in a regulation in the United States is through our Superfund program, which charges legally polluters with cleaning up sites that they've contaminated. We think about how policies are formed. We can think about many key aspects that help policy to be developed and implemented. There's important factors that influence this that we won't go into in detail in this presentation, but I hope you'll read more about this both in the book and as we start to think about the ways that this impacts how policies are implemented in the United States and around the world. As I mentioned in the last presentation, risk assessment is really important to environmental regulation and the policy process. It uses approaches that balance economic and health costs with benefits that may accrue through policy alternatives. Here, is an example of how we can use risk assessment to help balance and decide policy. Of course, we can identify a hazard, think about the exposure, the risks, and who's vulnerable, and ultimately decide how we value that risk, how we avoid it, and how we pay for those costs to avoid it. If we think about a hazardous chemical in the environment, such as a pesticide, we can ask people to choose organic food, and that's one way they may avoid pesticides on their food. However, there are other ways, perhaps chemical substitutions, that we don't have to use the pesticide. Each of those has benefits and risks and different costs to society. Risk management, as we discussed before, is adoption of steps to eliminate identified risks or to lower them to acceptable levels determined by an agency that has taken into account public preference. When we set the standards for air pollution, like for ozone pollution, that regulatory process also allows for public comment and input. And guidance can be changed because of public input. And public means everyone. It means the industries that might be putting out the pollutants and the people that are concerned about the health effects from ozone exposure. Ways that we use risk management might be standard setting laws. We have a lot of these laws in the United States. They regulate air quality, they regulate water quality. They give us guidance for how clean the soil needs to be, for how much pesticide we can allow on our food. We can use monitoring to manage risk. There are lots of ways we can manage risk in the environment. In the United States, we will use environmental impacts assessments to assess the impact of human activities on the environmental consequences. This is often required if construction's being done, if a new hazardous waste site is being implemented, etc. And more recently, a new approach has also been included, which is called health impact assessment, a method for estimating the proposed project policy and the impact on the health of the population. This could be urban redevelopment, development of roads, or large projects like power plants or airports. There are a large number of organizations that work to protect health and guarantee environmental health. This ranges from the World Health Organization at the global level that just provides guidelines for countries to adopt, to our federal regulatory agency, the Environmental Protection Agency. Within states, each state has its own agency that might work to protect public health. The Georgia Department of Public Health has one. We also have the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. And then further down, we have counties or city agencies. In the state of Georgia, we have county level agencies that work to protect environmental health. In New York City, they have a city agency that works to protect environmental health. Within all of these different agencies, there are laws to protect water, organizations that support how utilities are operated, etc. As I mentioned, the World Health Organization is an international agency also responsible for providing guidelines about environmental health at the global level. It provides leadership but doesn't actually set standards that countries have to enforce. The United States uses the Environmental Protection Agency to set and enforce standards. It was created in 1970 and it's established. It reports directly to the White House, and it was in response to a growing demand for cleaner water, air, and land. The National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health protects workers through the federal agency and the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Within each of these organizations, we may have an act that supports a different area of the environment. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency is responsible for enforcing the Clean Air Act. This is a comprehensive law that regulates air quality from different sources, cars, power plants, And it also set up a monitoring and measuring program that regulates ambient air quality or outdoor air quality through the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS. This is a series of standards that we measure and monitor at key points throughout various cities in the United States. The Clean Water Act, also administered by the EPA, was developed to address pollution of our waterways. In the 70s, rivers were so polluted that they caught on fire, and there was a huge demand for reducing pollution into these waterways. It allows discharges and regulates how much can be put into bodies of water. The Safe Drinking Water Act focuses specifically on water coming to your home. It protects the quality of the drinking water of the United States, and it requires that all public water systems, like the local water system that provides water to your house, operate and meet the standards of the Safe Drinking Water Act, which are primarily health-related standards. No lead or low levels of lead in water. No bacteria in water that are potentially hazardous to your health. NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, was one of the first laws that had a broad framework for protecting our environment. Its goal is to ensure that all branches of government give consideration to the environment prior to undertaking any action. So this isn't a law that's enforced by one agency, but it requires that the agencies across the country, across our federal agencies, employ this act when they are making changes, when they are setting laws, when they are taking actions. FIFRA, or the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, requires that sale, use, and distribution of pesticides be controlled. This is not the can of Raid that you buy at the grocery store, but this is if someone comes out and treats your home with a pesticide, or you're a farmer and you buy pesticides to treat your field. This is where you would go and get licensed to use these chemicals. And the goal is that using the pesticide will not generally or unreasonably harm the environment. TSCA, or Toxic Substances Control Act, requires new chemicals to be regulated and reviewed. It has a reporting, record keeping, and testing requirements, and it has a review of more than 80,000 chemicals. CERCLA, or better known as Superfund, is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. This allows for the government to prosecute people or companies that are responsible for uncontrolled or abandoned hazardous waste sites. It uses laws to prosecute and recuperate the costs of cleaning up those sites. There are many of these sites across the nation, and they are cleaned up periodically over time. RCRA, or Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, is what's called cradle-to-grave legislation. Anyone that has generated, transported, used, treated, stored, or disposed of hazardous waste has to have a permit. It allows you to track where this waste is going, and it can reduce the leaking or hazardous substances from getting into the environment and people being exposed on accident. The Endangered Species Act provides a program for conservation of plants and animals. It's supported through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and there's a growing list of endangered species. And if we think back to carrying capacity, this is one of the challenges we face as a planet. As our population grows, pressures put on other species, and we see more and more species getting put on the endangered species list, including insects, fish, mammals.